The sea was the color of gunmetal on the morning of April 7th, 1945, stretching endlessly beneath a sky that couldn't decide between storm and sun. Commander Joseph Franklin Enright stood on the bridge of the USS Indianapolis, his hands gripping the rail with a tension that had become as familiar as breathing. The Pacific stretched in all directions, vast and indifferent, swallowing ships and men with equal ease, keeping their stories in its dark depths where no one would ever find them. Beside him, Lieutenant Commander Robert Samuel Hartley studied the radar scope with the intensity of a man reading his own future. Contact bearing 270, range 32,000 yards, and closing. Multiple signatures. This is it, Commander. This is really it. Joseph didn't respond immediately. He was thinking about his wife, Eleanor, about the last letter he'd written her 3 days ago, about how he'd promised to come home when this was over. He was thinking about how every man on this ship had made the same promise to someone, how those promises hung in the air like prayers that might or might not be answered. The radio crackled with static and distant voices, other ships in the fleet coordinating movements, preparing for what they all knew was coming. Intelligence had confirmed it yesterday. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, was making a suicide run toward Okinawa. One final desperate gamble by an empire that knew it was dying but refused to die quietly. The great ship wasn't alone. She traveled with a screen of cruisers and destroyers, the last remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy's surface fleet, sailing toward a battle they couldn't win but felt honor-bound to fight. All ahead full, Joseph ordered, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. Sound general quarters. This is not a drill. The alarm rang throughout the ship, a sound that had become the soundtrack of their lives. Men ran to their stations with practiced efficiency, their faces a mixture of determination and fear that no amount of training could completely erase. Below decks, in the engine rooms, Chief Petty Officer Michael Patrick O'Brien was already pushing the Indianapolis to her limits, coaxing every knot of speed from machinery that had been at sea too long, that had seen too much action. Michael was 42 years old, ancient by naval standards, a career man who had joined the Navy when most of these boys were still learning to walk. He'd survived Pearl Harbor, survived the Solomons, survived battles whose names the history books would argue over for decades. He had a daughter named Katie back in Boston, 17 years old, who wrote him letters full of gossip about boys and school and a world that seemed impossibly distant from this steel tomb filled with the roar of engines and the smell of oil and sweat. "Give me everything she's got, Chief," came the voice through the intercom, and Michael nodded even though no one could see him. "You'll get it, sir," he called back. "Every damn thing." On the bridge, Joseph was receiving reports from the fleet. The cruisers USS St. Louis, USS Portland, USS Biloxi, and USS Mobile were moving into position, along with destroyers forming a screen. Aircraft from the carriers were already in the air, wave after wave of them, but Command wanted the surface fleet engaged as well. They wanted to make sure that if the Yamato somehow survived the air assault, she wouldn't survive what came next. Lieutenant James Theodore Morrison, the ship's gunnery officer, was running calculations with his fire control team, his mind working through trajectories and deflections, and 1,000 variables that could mean the difference between a hit and a miss, between survival and going to the bottom. James was 28, an engineering graduate from MIT who had been days away from a civilian career when Pearl Harbor changed everything. He'd enlisted the next morning, driven by something he couldn't quite name: patriotism, anger, or maybe just the understanding that the world he'd been planning for no longer existed. "Range to target?" Joseph asked. 28,000 yards and closing. We should have visual contact in approximately 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Joseph thought about how much could happen in 12 minutes. You could fall in love. You could die. You could make a decision that would haunt you for the rest of your life, or save you from ever having to make another one. He'd learned that time was elastic in combat, that seconds could stretch like hours, and hours could compress into heartbeats. The first visual contact came from the crow's nest. Seaman First Class Daniel Wright called down with a voice, trying hard to stay professional. Multiple contacts on the horizon. Large ships. I count. Jesus. I count at least 8, maybe more. Through his binoculars, Joseph could see them, now dark shapes, against the gray horizon, growing larger with each passing moment. The Yamato was unmistakable even at this distance, a massive silhouette that dwarfed everything around her. She was accompanied by the cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, Fuyuzuki, Suzutsuki, Kasumi, Isokaze, Hamakaze, Yukikaze, Asashimo, and Hatsushimo. The last fighting ships of a navy that had once dominated these waters, now reduced to this final, desperate gesture. On the bridge of the cruiser Yahagi, Captain Tamichi Hara stood with his own binoculars raised, watching the American fleet materialize from the morning mist. He was 42 years old, a veteran of countless battles, a man who had survived when so many others had died. He knew what was coming. They all knew. This wasn't a mission designed for survival, it was a mission designed to prove that they hadn't forgotten how to fight, that they could still die with honor even if they couldn't win with strategy. Beside him, his executive officer, Commander Masayoshi Yoshimura, was coordinating with the other ships, maintaining formation, preparing for the inevitable. Masayoshi was 35, married with 3 children he hadn't seen in 8 months, children who were somewhere in the ruins of what had been Tokyo, if they were still alive at all. He'd stopped receiving letters 6 weeks ago. He didn't know if that meant the mail service had collapsed, or if there was simply no one left to write. American cruisers and destroyers bearing 090, came the report from the lookout. Multiple contacts. They're forming a battle line. Tamechi nodded slowly. He'd expected this. The Americans wouldn't rely solely on air power, not for a target this valuable, not when they had the surface ships to do the job properly. He thought about his own career, about all the battles he'd fought, all the ships he'd sunk, all the men on both sides who had gone into the dark water and never come back up. He thought about his wife Yoshiko, about the garden at their home in Kyoto, about cherry blossoms that might or might not bloom this year, depending on whether the city was still standing. All ships, prepare for surface engagement, he ordered. Fire control, acquire targets, and stand by. The distance between the 2 fleets was closing rapidly now. Joseph could see the details of the Japanese ships more clearly, the aggressive rake of their bows, the bristling gun turrets, the battle flags flying despite the wind and spray. They were beautiful in a terrible way, these instruments of death, these floating cities of steel that existed for no other purpose than to destroy each other. "Fire control reports ready, sir," James called out. "We have firing solutions on the lead destroyer." Joseph nodded. "All ships, this is Indianapolis. Stand by to commence firing on my mark. Target the escorts first. Let the airboys deal with Yamato." But even as he gave the order, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. War never was. The Japanese weren't going to simply sail into range and accept destruction. They would fight, and they would fight hard, because that was all they had left. The first shots came from the Yahagi, her 8-inch guns opening fire at maximum range, sending shells arcing across the sky in graceful parabolas that belied their deadly purpose. The water erupted in towering columns where they fell short, the sea reaching up toward the sky, as if trying to pull the ships down into its embrace. "All batteries, commence firing," Joseph ordered, and the Indianapolis shuddered as her own guns opened up, adding her voice to the growing thunder. The battle began in earnest then, a savage exchange of fire, at ranges where the human eye could barely track the shells in flight. The USS Street. Louis, under Captain John Bell Roberts, opened fire with her 15 6-inch guns, her turrets traversing smoothly as her fire control computer fed coordinates to the gun crews. John was 39, a Naval Academy graduate who had served in the Atlantic before being transferred to the Pacific, who had a son serving on a destroyer somewhere in this same vast ocean, though he hadn't heard from him in weeks. The USS Portland, commanded by Captain Thomas Gordon Settle, maneuvered to position herself between the Japanese formation and the rest of the fleet, her 9 8-inch guns speaking with deep, authoritative voices. Thomas was 45, old enough to remember when battleships were the queens of the sea, when aircraft were novelties, when the idea of a carrier-based airstrike seemed like science fiction. The world had changed, and he'd changed with it, but some part of him still belonged to that older time, that simpler era, when war was somehow more straightforward, more honest. The Japanese destroyers began weaving evasive patterns, laying smoke screens that billowed across the water like fog, obscuring their movements. The Hamikaze, under Commander Fumitake Toma, launched torpedoes in a spread pattern, the deadly fish racing through the water at 48 knots, leaving trails of bubbles that looked almost peaceful from a distance. Fumitake was 31, the youngest captain in the flotilla, a man who had been marked for great things before the war turned against them, before great things became survival, and survival became this final voyage with no return ticket. On the Indianapolis, the radar operator called out torpedo tracks, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Torpedoes in the water, bearing 285, range 4,000 yards and closing." Joseph didn't hesitate. "Hard to starboard, all ahead flank. Deploy countermeasures." The cruiser heeled over hard, her engine screaming as she turned into the torpedo spread, presenting the smallest possible target. The torpedoes passed less than 50 yards off her port beam, close enough that men on deck could see them just beneath the surface, dark shapes that carried death in their warheads. The USS Biloxi, under Captain Daniel Fay Reynolds, wasn't as lucky. A torpedo from the destroyer Isokaze caught her amidships, the explosion tearing a hole 20 feet across in her hull, sending a geyser of water and debris skyward. Men were thrown from their feet. Machinery was torn from its mountings. Compartments flooded in seconds. Daniel felt the deck lurch beneath him, heard the terrible sound of his ship screaming, and began barking orders even before the damage reports started coming in. "Damage control to frame 65, multiple flooding. We're taking on water fast," came the report from below. Lieutenant Richard Earl Hayes was already leading his damage control team into the flooded compartments, wading through water that was rising with terrifying speed, trying to shore up bulkheads, trying to save a ship that was fighting to stay afloat. Richard was 26. An architecture student who had planned to design houses before the war taught him how to save ships instead. He worked with methodical precision, directing his men with hand signals because the roar of rushing water made speech impossible, feeling the cold seep into his bones, knowing that if the bulkhead gave way they would all drown in the dark, that their bodies would be trapped in these steel corridors forever. Above decks, the battle continued with savage intensity. The Yahagi was taking fire from 3 American cruisers simultaneously, shells hammering her superstructure, starting fires that her crew fought desperately to control. Captain Hara Tamichi moved through the chaos with eerie calm, directing his ship's response, never raising his voice, despite the hell erupting around him. A shell from the USS Portland struck the Yahagi's forward turret, penetrating the armor and detonating inside. The explosion was catastrophic, killing the entire gun crew instantly, sending flames shooting from every opening. Ensign Hiroshi Tanaka was in charge of the aft damage control party, and he led his men forward into the inferno without hesitation, dragging hoses, fighting fires that seemed to laugh at their efforts. Hiroshi was 23, fresh from the Naval Academy, this being his first real combat assignment. He'd expected to be afraid, but instead he felt strangely disconnected, as if he were watching himself from a distance, as if this were happening to someone else. He pulled burned men from wreckage, organized bucket brigades when the pumps failed, worked until his hands were blistered and his lungs burned from smoke inhalation. The destroyer Hamikaze took a direct hit from a shell fired by the USS Mobile, the projectile passing completely through her thin hull and exploding on the far side. The blast tore her engine room open to the sea, killed everyone stationed there in an instant. Commander Fumitake Toma felt his ship lose way, felt her settling in the water, and knew with sudden clarity that she was dying. He gave the order to abandon ship, though he had no intention of following it himself. A captain didn't leave his vessel. That was tradition, honor, the code he'd been raised with. As his crew began launching rafts and life preservers, as they jumped into the oil-slicked water, Fumitake stood on his bridge and watched the battle continue around him. The Yamato was taking massive damage from the air attacks, bombs and torpedoes striking her again and again, but she was still moving, still fighting, still refusing to die. The USS Indianapolis launched her floatplanes to provide spotting for the fleet, the small observation aircraft rising from their catapults and buzzing toward the Japanese formation like angry hornets. Lieutenant William Francis Murphy piloted one of them, circling at 3,000 feet, radioing back fire corrections, watching the battle unfold beneath him with a perspective no one on the surface could have. William was 25, from a farming family in Iowa, the first person in his family to ever see the ocean, let alone fly over it. From up here, the battle looked almost abstract, ships trailing smoke, water erupting in white flowers where shells fell, tiny figures visible on decks, their humanity reduced to specks against gray steel. It was easier this way to forget that each of those specks was a person, someone's son or father or husband, someone who had dreams and fears and people waiting for them at home. A shell from the destroyer, Fuyuzuki's anti-aircraft guns, exploded near his plane, shrapnel tearing through the thin aluminum skin, shredding his left wing. William felt the aircraft lurch, felt control slipping away, and pointed the nose toward the water, hoping he could ditch without killing himself. The impact was brutal, the plane cartwheeling across the surface before coming to rest partially submerged. William clawed his way out of the cockpit, inflated his life vest, and began swimming away from the wreckage, praying that someone would pick him up before he became target practice or shark bait. On the Yahagi, the situation was becoming desperate. Fires were raging out of control. Ammunition stores were threatening to explode. Casualties were mounting by the minute. Commander Masayoshi Yoshimura moved through the ship, coordinating evacuation of the most heavily damaged sections, helping wounded men to the sick bay, which was itself filling beyond capacity. The ship's doctor, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Nakamura, was performing triage with the cold efficiency of someone who had long ago accepted that he couldn't save everyone. Takeshi was 38, a surgeon who had practiced in Tokyo before the war, who had delivered babies and removed appendices and treated routine illnesses. Now he amputated limbs without anesthesia, sutured wounds that would have been death sentences in any properly equipped hospital, made decisions about who might survive and who was beyond help. A young sailor, no more than 19, lay on one of the tables with his abdomen torn open by shrapnel. He was conscious, which was worse, looking up at Takeshi with eyes that understood what the doctor's expression meant. "Am I going to die, sir?" the boy asked. Takeshi had stopped lying to dying men months ago. "Yes," he said gently. "I'm sorry." The boy nodded, tears mixing with the blood on his face. "Tell my mother. Tell her I wasn't afraid." "I'll tell her," Takeshi promised, knowing he never would, knowing he would probably never survive to tell anyone anything. "You were very brave." The boy died 3 minutes later. One more name added to a list that had grown too long to count. One more family that would receive notification that their son had died, serving the emperor, died with honor, died for something that no longer made any sense to anyone except the men ordering them to their deaths. The USS Indianapolis and USS Street Louis were concentrating their fire on the destroyer Isokaze now, their shells falling in a pattern that gave the Japanese ship nowhere to run. Captain Katsumi Maeda had been hit twice already, shrapnel from near misses cutting his face, blood running down into his uniform. He stood at his post regardless, conning his ship through the steel storm, knowing it was only a matter of time, but determined to make that time count. Katsumi was 41, a career officer who had fought in the Russo-Japanese War as a young ensign, who had seen the Navy grow from a regional force to one of the most powerful in the world, and now witnessed its destruction. He thought about his wife Emiko, about his 2 sons who were old enough to fight now, though he'd managed to keep them in school, safe from the war that was devouring their generation. He hoped they would survive, hoped they would have a chance to rebuild, to create something better than this endless cycle of violence. A shell from the Indianapolis struck the Isokaze's bridge directly, the armor-piercing round penetrating the thin plating and exploding inside. Captain Maeda was killed instantly, along with most of his command staff. The ship, mortally wounded, began to list heavily to port, taking on water through multiple breaches, her engines dead, her guns silent. Survivors began abandoning ship, jumping into water that was cold enough to kill a man in 20 minutes, swimming away from the dying destroyer with whatever strength they had left. Some were picked up by other Japanese ships. Most weren't. The sea took them, pulled them down to join the thousands who had already died in these waters, who had become part of the Pacific's vast and growing cemetery. On the bridge of the USS Portland, Captain Thomas Gordon Settle was receiving damage reports from across the fleet. The Biloxi was still afloat, but barely, limping along at reduced speed, her crew fighting to keep her from capsizing. 2 destroyers had taken damage from near misses. One had a fire in her forward magazine that her crew was desperately trying to control. But the Japanese were suffering worse, much worse. The destroyer, Asashimo, had been sunk by a combined attack from dive bombers and torpedo planes, going down with most of her crew. The Hamikaze was dead in the water, listing badly, waiting for the inevitable. The Yahagi was a floating wreck, still fighting but clearly doomed. And overhead, the air battle continued, wave after wave of American planes hammering the Yamato with bombs and torpedoes, each hit bringing the massive battleship closer to her end. Thomas watched through his binoculars, feeling something he didn't want to name. Not quite pity, not quite regret, but something close to sorrow. These were brave men dying out there, men who fought for a cause Thomas believed was wrong, but who fought nonetheless with courage and skill. War made no distinction between the just and the unjust when it came to suffering. Pain was pain, death was death, loss was loss. "Sir," the Yahagi is signaling. The communications officer called out. She's broadcasting in the clear, requesting assistance for survivors in the water. Thomas looked toward the burning Japanese cruiser, toward the tiny dots of men swimming in the debris field around her. Standard procedure was to ignore such requests, to let the enemy deal with their own casualties. But something made him hesitate, made him remember a letter his son had written him months ago, asking if the Japanese were really monsters, like the propaganda posters said. "We are not monsters," Thomas had written back. "Neither are they. We are all just men trying to survive a war none of us wanted." He made a decision that would probably be questioned by some, praised by others, and misunderstood by most. Signal our destroyers to begin rescue operations for survivors in the water, Japanese and American alike. Anyone who's in the water gets picked up. His executive officer stared at him. "Sir, you heard me. We're not going to leave men to drown if we can help it. This battle's over. They're no threat to us anymore." On the Yahagi, Captain Hara Tamechi received the report with something approaching disbelief. The Americans were going to rescue survivors? After everything? He looked around his ruined bridge, at the fires still burning, at the bodies of men he'd served with, men he'd led to their deaths. He thought about all the lectures they'd received about American brutality, about how the enemy would show no mercy, would torture prisoners, would dishonor the dead. Propaganda. All of it propaganda. These Americans were showing more humanity than his own superiors had, more compassion than the officers who had sent them on this suicide mission with full knowledge that none of them would return. "Give the order to abandon ship," he said quietly. "All hands who are able, into the water. Try to get clear before she goes down." Commander Masayoshi Yoshimura began coordinating the evacuation, helping the wounded over the side, distributing life preservers, trying to save as many as he could. Masayoshi didn't know if he would survive the next hour, didn't know if American destroyers would really pick them up or if it was some cruel trick. But he knew that staying on the Yahagi meant certain death, so he helped man after man into the water and finally followed them himself. the shock of the cold sea taking his breath away. The Yahagi capsized 20 minutes later, her hull rolling slowly until she was completely inverted, floating like a dead whale for a few minutes before the sea claimed her entirely. Captain Hara Tamichi was still aboard, having refused to leave, having made his peace with death. He stood in what had been his cabin, now tilted at a crazy angle, water rushing in through shattered ports, and thought about his wife, about his garden, about cherry blossoms. The water reached him and pulled him down into darkness that was complete and final. The destroyer Kasumi tried to run, making a desperate dash to the north, hoping to escape the overwhelming American force. She was pursued by the USS Morrison and USS Wickus, the American destroyers, faster and more maneuverable, their crews fresh, while the Japanese were exhausted from hours of combat. The chase lasted 45 minutes before the Kasumi took a fatal hit to her engine room, losing power and coasting to a stop. Her captain, Commander Teiji Sugihara, gave the order to scuttle rather than be captured. His crew opened seacocks and set demolition charges, abandoned ship in good order, and watched as their vessel slipped beneath the waves with colors still flying. One more funeral in an ocean that had seen too many. The Yukikaze, the luckiest destroyer in the Japanese fleet, somehow survived the battle, despite taking multiple hits. She limped away trailing smoke, her crew manning manual steering after her bridge was destroyed, her engines held together by the skill and determination of engineers who refused to let her die. She would make it back to Japan, the only major surface combatant to survive the day, carrying with her the stories of men who hadn't been as fortunate. By mid-afternoon, the battle was essentially over. The Yamato had finally capsized and sunk after taking an incredible amount of punishment, her death throes so violent that they created a mushroom cloud visible for 100 miles. The Yahagi was gone. 4 destroyers were sunk, the others scattered or limping away. The American fleet had taken damage but no losses, and now the destroyers were moving through the debris field, picking up survivors. Lieutenant Commander Robert Samuel Hartley commanded the rescue operations from the Indianapolis's motor launch, directing boats to concentrate on the densest clusters of men in the water. He watched as exhausted Japanese sailors were pulled aboard, some injured, some in shock, all of them looking stunned that they were being helped rather than machine-gunned. One young sailor, perhaps 20 years old, collapsed on the deck of the motor launch and began sobbing uncontrollably. Robert knelt beside him, not speaking because they shared no common language, just resting a hand on the boy's shoulder while he cried. After a while, the sailor looked up at him with red eyes and said something in Japanese that Robert didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Robert said, and he meant it. Chief Petty Officer Michael Patrick O'Brien came up from the engine room to see the rescue operations, standing on deck, watching as boat after boat returned with survivors. He saw the faces of these men who had been trying to kill him an hour ago, saw their exhaustion and fear and relief, and recognized himself in them. They were all just sailors, all just men trying to stay alive, serving causes they hadn't chosen in a war they didn't control. A Japanese officer, Commander Masayoshi Yoshimura, was brought aboard the Indianapolis, still wearing his uniform, despite hours in the water. He stood on the deck dripping, his face a mask of confusion and something that might have been shame. Commander Joseph Franklin Enright approached him, offering his hand in a gesture that transcended language and nationality. Masayoshi looked at the offered hand for a long moment before taking it. His grip was weak, his body trembling from cold and shock, and the realization that he had survived when so many others hadn't. "Why?" he managed in broken English. "Why you save us?" Joseph thought about all the possible answers. Because it was the right thing to do. Because the battle was over. Because they were human beings in need of help. In the end, he gave the simplest answer. Because we could. The rescued Japanese sailors were given dry clothes, hot food, medical attention. The Indianapolis's sickbay was overwhelmed. Corpsman First Class David Alexander Mitchell, working to treat wounds and hypothermia alongside Japanese wounded, that his medical oath required him to help equally. David was 30, a pre-med student who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, who had seen enough death and suffering to last several lifetimes. He worked on a young Japanese sailor with a severe leg wound, cleaning and bandaging it with the same care he would have given an American. The sailor watched him with wide eyes, not understanding what was happening, why this American was being gentle when he expected brutality. When David finished, the sailor bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect that transcended the war, the battle, everything that had brought them to this moment. As evening fell, the fleet began the long journey back toward Okinawa. The rescued Japanese sailors would be taken to POW camps, where they would spend the rest of the war in relative safety, far from the combat that had claimed so many of their comrades. Some would return to Japan after the surrender, would rebuild their lives, would tell stories about the day the Iron Giants collided, and how, in the aftermath, enemies had chosen humanity over hatred. On the bridge of the Indianapolis, Joseph Franklin Enright stood watching the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed almost obscene in their beauty after a day of such violence. Lieutenant James Theodore Morrison joined him, both men silent for a long time. "Did we do the right thing?" James finally asked. "Rescuing them?" Joseph thought about it. "I don't know if there's a right thing in war, just degrees of wrong. But if we'd left them to drown, if we'd shown the same callousness that this war has made commonplace, then what would we be? What would we become? Human," James said quietly. "We'd still be human, would we?" Joseph turned to face him. "I've seen what this war does to men, how it strips away everything we thought we were until we're just animals fighting over territory. Today, for a few hours, we got to be better than that. We got to choose mercy over vengeance, compassion over cruelty. Maybe that doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Maybe tomorrow we'll be right back to killing each other without a second thought. But today, right now, it matters to the men we pulled out of the water. It matters that they're alive instead of dead, that they'll have a chance to go home someday, to see their families, to rebuild." James nodded slowly. "My father wrote me a letter last month. He said the only thing that matters in this life is how we treat each other when we have the power to do harm and choose not to." I didn't understand what he meant until today. Down in the enlisted men's mess, Chief Petty Officer Michael Patrick O'Brien was writing a letter to his daughter Katie. He wrote about the battle, about the rescue operations, about watching enemy sailors become simply sailors, simply men, simply fellow human beings, deserving of dignity and compassion. He wrote about how he hoped she would grow up in a world where such choices were easier, where wars were rarer, where people remembered that their common humanity was more important than their national differences. He didn't know if she would understand. He didn't fully understand it himself. But he knew that what had happened today was important, that it meant something beyond tactics and strategy and the grinding arithmetic of war. It meant that even in the midst of mechanized death, even surrounded by the machinery of destruction, human kindness could still break through, could still assert itself, could still matter. In the sickbay, Corpsman David Alexander Mitchell was making his final rounds, checking on patients American and Japanese alike. He stopped beside the bed of a Japanese petty officer who had severe burns across his back and shoulders. The man was sleeping fitfully, occasionally crying out in his dreams, reliving horrors that David could only imagine. David adjusted the man's IV drip, made a note in his chart, and moved on. He treated 18 men that night who had been trying to kill him that morning. He lost 2 of them, both American, both too badly wounded to save despite everything he tried. He wept for them, quietly, in a storage closet where no one could see, then dried his eyes and went back to work. Commander Masayoshi Yoshimura lay in his bunk, a bunk given to him by his enemies, in a ship that should have been his coffin, and stared at the ceiling. He thought about his wife, about his children, about whether they were still alive in Tokyo. He thought about Captain Hara, about all the men who had died today, about the Yahagi lying at the bottom of the Pacific, along with so many other ships, so many other dreams. He thought about the American commander shaking his hand, about the simple phrase, "because we could," about what it meant that kindness could exist even here, even now, even between men whose governments had ordered them to kill each other without mercy or hesitation. He didn't have answers. He wasn't sure answers existed. But he was alive, breathing air that should have been water, looking forward to a future that should have been non-existent. That had to mean something. It had to. The USS Indianapolis continued steaming through the night, her wake phosphorescent in the darkness, leaving a trail of light that faded as quickly as it formed. Aboard her were hundreds of men, American and Japanese, victor and vanquished, saved and saver, all thinking about the day that had just passed, all trying to make sense of violence and compassion existing side by side, all wondering what it meant for the future. Joseph Franklin Enright returned to his cabin at 0200 hours, exhausted beyond words. He sat at his small desk and pulled out the letter he'd been writing to his wife Eleanor. He added a new paragraph, his handwriting shaky from fatigue. Today we fought a battle that will probably be forgotten by history, overshadowed by bigger names and bigger events. But I want you to know that today, in the aftermath of violence, we chose to be better than the war demanded. We saved men who had been trying to kill us, not because we had to, but because it was right. Because in the end, Eleanor, we're all just human beings, trying to survive, trying to get home, trying to hold on to the things that make us who we are. I hope I can hold on to this feeling, this certainty that kindness matters even when everything around us says it doesn't. I hope I can bring this home with me when I finally come back to you. He sealed the letter, knowing it would be weeks before Eleanor received it, knowing that by then he would have fought other battles, seen other horrors, made other choices that would test his humanity. But for now, in this moment, he felt something like peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, but the quiet knowledge that he had done what he could, that he had chosen compassion when brutality would have been easier, that he had proven to himself and to his men that the war hadn't completely destroyed their souls. The battle between the Iron Giants was over. The Yamato and her escorts were destroyed, scattered across the ocean floor, where they would rust away slowly over decades and centuries, becoming homes for fish and coral. Their steel bones, testament to a war that had consumed millions of lives and accomplished nothing that couldn't have been achieved through wisdom and compassion. But the real victory, the one that no history book would record, was smaller and more profound. It was in the choice to see enemies as human beings. It was in hands reaching down to pull drowning men from the water. It was in medical care given without discrimination. It was in the understanding that mercy was not weakness, that compassion was not surrender, that being human meant more than simply being the last one standing. The sun rose on April 8th, 1945, painting the Pacific in shades of pink and gold. The fleet sailed on, carrying with it the rescued and the rescuers, the living and the memories of the dead. And somewhere in that mixture of hope and sorrow, victory and loss, violence and kindness, was a truth that wars tried their best to obscure. That in the end, we are all just human beings, searching for meaning in a world that often seems determined to strip meaning away. The Iron Giants had collided and been destroyed, but the men, fragile, flawed, capable of both terrible cruelty and unexpected grace, the men survived. And in their survival, in their choices, in their moments of compassion amidst the chaos, they proved that even the most powerful machines ever built by human hands were less important, less meaningful, less worthy of remembrance than the simple act of one person helping another when they didn't have to, when it served no strategic purpose, when the only reason was because it was right. That was the story of April 7th, 1945. Not the sinking of the Yamato, not the tactical victory, not the dominance of American naval power. The story was simpler and more profound, that in the midst of mechanized death, humanity survived. That even at war, people could choose kindness, that the iron giants might collide and destroy each other, but the human spirit, battered, tested, pushed to its limits, could still remember what it meant to be human. And in the years that followed, when the survivors, American and Japanese alike, returned to their homes, when they tried to rebuild lives and nations from the ruins of war, they would carry that memory with them. The memory of a day when enemies became simply men in need of help. A day when the choice to save rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to show mercy rather than vengeance, proved that the war had not succeeded in making monsters of them all. That memory would sustain them through the hard years of rebuilding, through the nightmares and the guilt and the sorrow. It would remind them that despite everything, despite the death and destruction, despite the propaganda and hatred, despite the machinery of war that had tried to reduce them to cogs in a killing machine, they had remained human. They had chosen compassion. They had proven that even in the darkest moments, light could still break through. The iron giants had collided and sunk beneath the waves. But the men survived, carrying with them a story that needed to be told, a truth that needed to be remembered, that in the end, what defines us is not the battles we fight, but the choices we make, the kindness we show, the humanity we preserve, even when everything around us says we should abandon it. That was the legacy of April 7th, 1945. That was the real victory. And it would endure long after the last piece of wreckage had rusted away, long after the last survivor had passed, long after the war itself had become nothing more than history. Because some truths transcend time, transcend conflict, transcend the temporary divisions that nations create. And the truth that we are all human, all deserving of compassion, all connected by our shared vulnerability and our shared hope for a better world, that truth is eternal.